So here we are at the courthouse, April 25th, 2023, for the Carroll versus Trump Carroll II trial. And now something that you just need to know up front about just to better understand these proceedings. Despite this being called the R-word trial, this was not a criminal trial. This was a little bit different because it's a civil proceeding. And the rules of what is necessary to find someone liable for something in a civil court are different than they are in a criminal court. So for the battery charge, the standard of proof was a preponderance of evidence, which was basically that the evidence was more likely true than it was not true. Okay. And then for the defamation claim, it was there needed to be clear and convincing evidence that it was malicious in nature. They needed evidence of actual malice in Donald Trump's words in him making that post, and that he was aware of what he was doing. The jury was selected and it was anonymous. The identities of the jurors were kept secret from both sides for the entire trial, as well as to the judge. And that was because of Donald Trump continuously leaking information about the trial and trying to put information out there that he wasn't supposed to be talking about. So the judge wanted to prevent any jury mingling of that, any jury influence. And it proved to be quite warranted that Judge Kaplan had to go about it this way, since this was pretty unprecedented in such a high-profile case like this. That would need to be done, because Trump, he didn't even make it to the trial date yet before he already broke that rule. He was already breaking that rule the very day that the jury selection concluded, and Carroll's team had to alert Judge Kaplan that very morning, right after the day when the jury selection had completed, that Trump had posted about two of the topics that Judge Kaplan had said,
absolutely you're not to talk about these things because it could sway the jury.
It could murky the jury. Judge Kaplan did not want to play at all. He ran a tight ship from the beginning. And so that morning, Judge Kaplan addressed Tacopina, which was Donald Trump's lawyer, Joseph Tacopina. He basically warned him that Trump's statements were potentially sanctionable conduct. And I have a quote here. It says that the judge remarked,
I said something this morning. Now it's his son doing it.
And so what happened was, after he said,
don't do that, that's potentially sanctionable conduct,
then Eric Trump posted something about the same thing, about the case, about the topics that were just told to Trump to stop with a warning. So then Judge Kaplan said to Tacopina,
there are some relevant United States statutes here, and somebody on your side ought to be thinking about them.
Okay. And then Tacopina told the court that he would speak to Trump and ask him to stop posting about the case. I'm laughing about it, but it's just because he's just such a big, goofy baby man loser. Who does that? But it's really not funny. This is what is so infuriating to me about the fact that people wanted to vote this person as the president of our country, and they aren't embarrassed of that. This person can't even follow simple rules of a courtroom because he thinks he's so above the law that he doesn't have to listen to that. And then he goes to the media and constantly says,
the judge was so hard on me. The judge wouldn't let me. The judge was out to get us, and it was against me, Donald Trump, and da-da-da-da.
No, because Judge Kaplan had a very open history of being this exact way in his courtrooms across the board. He was a no-nonsense judge. He handled everybody the same. And if you directly defy the orders of the court, he's going to hold you accountable to that. And Trump did it repeatedly. So of course he was getting backlash. Of course he was getting focused on by the judge. He wouldn't obey the rules of the court. He can't do that. So, and remember, he was not president at this time. He was not the president. And it wouldn't matter if he was. All rise for the Honorable Judge Kaplan. Don't they say that or something like that? Yeah. Woo, hey, welcome. No, I think you're supposed to be quiet in court. Okay, shh, it's starting. The trial started out with the plaintiff's opening arguments. And this was presented by Roberta Kaplan, which was E. Jean Carroll's lawyer. She laid this out in a very succinct framework. She just gave a methodical, clear-eyed view of it. She told the jurors that there was a woman who was assaulted in a Bergorf Goodman's dressing room, and then that decades later, she was publicly called a liar by a very powerful man, the very powerful man who did the assaulting. She told the jurors that they would hear from Carroll herself, that she was going to come up here and she was going to tell her story in great detail, and then that they would hear from two of her friends that she actually reached out to directly after the assault happened, one literally within minutes after it happened, and the other in the following days. She told them that they would hear from two Bergdorf Goodman employees that could personally verify about Trump's regular attendance at Bergdorf Goodman and how often he shopped there, despite his presentation of not really being very familiar with the store and almost never going there and not even being able to say for sure if he ever went there. And then after that, Kaplan previewed the Access Hollywood tapes for the jury, and we all know what that one is. And then she made preview to the deposition by Trump, where he is directly addressing those comments from the Access Hollywood tapes, and where he tells his own account of why he said that and what that means, setting up what would become one of the most damning evidentiary moments of the entire trial. It's right up there, and it's wild, actually. A really important theme of the opening argument on the plaintiff's side was that she framed the case as having a very genuine, credible corroboration available, and basically putting it as, this is not a he said, she said, like the other side is going to try to make it seem. No, this is a case where 11 witnesses are going to corroborate the same story, whereas the other story is going to be simply Donald Trump himself on a tape full of his own denials. And that was all he had to offer. Then moving into the defamation claim, Kaplan told the jurors about Trump's 2022 post, where he called Carroll's allegations a hoax, said that this was all a con job, and implied that he had no idea who she was. And she let them know that that was demonstrably false. And that post was published with knowledge that it was false. And lastly, she told the jury that this case is not about money for E. Jean Carroll. There was no set amount of money being sought after. This was simply for E. Jean to get her reputation back, her stainless reputation that she had carried for her entire life without a spot on it. And she deserved that back. And that is where the plaintiff's side closed for their opening arguments. And then, guess who was up next? The defense. Okay? And now on the defense side, we have heavy hitter Joseph Tacopina, Trump's main lawyer for this case. Okay? Joseph Tacopina had an intense reputation. He was very aggressive in his approach, and pretty evident that he leaned into intimidation as a tactic. So Carroll knew that this was coming, and she was pretty prepared for it. But he still did come out pretty aggressive and swinging. So defense opens. Joseph Tacopina tells jurors that Carroll's account wasn't just false, but it was absolutely absurd, and that they would soon see that it is a story that's just impossible to believe. He mocked specific details of Carroll's account, raising the question of why a busy store like Bergorf Goodman's would ever be the scene of an assault like this. And obviously other shoppers would have noticed, and also why in the world Carroll, a smart, experienced woman, would follow someone into a private dressing room, someone that she didn't even know really at all. He called the allegations a quote-unquote affront to justice that minimized real victims. There's barely anything more infuriating than the person who is perpetrating, or the person on the side of those perpetrating, the person on the aggressor's side, whatever the case may be, for whatever topic you might want to be referring to, for that side to basically make an argument that flips it around on the victims of such acts and plays on the emotions and vulnerabilities of that population. It's just so, it's like, how low do you gotta go? Just so manipulative, so shisty, just grimy. I just hate it. Ugh. His next point was that Carroll just fabricated all of this for money or for political reasons. She was conspiring with the Democrats, apparently, and just for popularity, status. She wanted some attention. She was bored. She was not doing well. Her books were not doing well. She never wrote a good book, so she thought she would just include Donald Trump out of nowhere, and that would skyrocket her to fame or something, and fortune. I don't know. It wasn't working out quite that way for her. So this far, she lost her 27-year career. So most people, the outcome of coming out about a sexual assault is not positive attention. So I'm not sure why that continues to be a rumor of why people would do that. He said some really weird things here too. He said that E. Jean Carroll was a known diary keeper and that she never wrote about this in her diary. I have no idea how he knows that. And he said that the two Outcry witnesses that were her two friends were just part of the conspiracy as well, that they were in cahoots with also the two other victims from back that came out in 2016 about their story. Even though one happened at the end of the 80s and one happened in 2005, and the two women were vastly different ages, were not in the same circles, had no knowledge of each other, were not connected in any other way. Apparently, they all were in some powwow together, the five of them, and this has all been a very long conspiracy that is now reaching its peak, apparently, with E. Jean Carroll. So that's what he suggested. And they did this because they just hated Donald Trump, and they just hate the Republicans, and they're just radical leftists. Yeah. Trump's the actual victim, he says. And then he preemptively addressed the Access Hollywood tapes. This one was rich. He said he called it a foolish effort at some type of evidence, citing it as locker room talk. So sick of hearing that. And he made the point that all it shows is that women let those things happen. The word letting means that it was allowed. Okay. If they let you, then it's consensual. And I think that anybody who is familiar with sexual assault and consent knows that that is not accurate. That is not accurate at all. You don't have the right to just start touching and kissing people without any warning. Just because you're a star doesn't mean you can. Maybe some of them freeze up or they're scared or something, that doesn't mean that just because it was allowed to happen because after you forced it, that doesn't mean that there was consent. I hope everyone knows that. So I've seen some very troubling comments on some of these videos while I was doing my research, and I hate it. He informed the jurors that Trump would not be testifying live because there was nothing more for him to say on the matter, that he'd already addressed it and there was nothing to address. And he closed out with saying that, you are free to hate Donald Trump all you want, that it's okay to hate him. He said, go ahead. But he asked the jury to remember that having strong feelings about him or hating him is not the same as him being guilty. And that was the end of day 1. All right, so we're just going to fast forward. We're going to go right to day 2.
All rise.
April 26th begins with E. Jean Carroll on the stand, telling her story firsthand. After stating her name, confirming that information with Roberta Kaplan, her lawyer, her very first words really set the tone for the entire trial. The exact quote was,
"I'm here because Trump to me. He lied and shattered my reputation, and I'm trying to get my life back."
upon being asked why she was testifying here today. And then she walked the jury through the alleged incident in granular detail from the moment that she was leaving Bergorf Goodman's, so she thought, then did not end up leaving because at the doors she came face to face with Donald Trump, all the way up to when she ran out of those doors after being assaulted. And she didn't shy away from details. She told about thoughts she had during the encounter, things she saw, things that were said, everything she could possibly remember feeling, doing, looking at, everything. So here's the story in my best retelling from beginning to end that E. Jean Carroll gave on the stand. Now, earlier in the episode, during the flashback through E. Jean Carroll's life, I told you a brief summary of the occurrence. So I'm going to skip the first parts. We're going to go right to the part where they are upstairs and they are in the lingerie section because Donald Trump had said no to like hat suggestions and purse suggestions. So they had been moving through the store and he kind of directed her towards the lingerie and was like,
"Here's a gift I could get."
he seemed very interested and settled on getting a piece of lingerie. And so Carroll decides to ask more information to be able to pick a more specialized, accurate gift to help him out. And she asks,
"Is this woman a young woman? Is this someone more my age?"
he says,
"Well, how old are you?"
and Carroll says,
"I'm 52.
or she might have been 51, I can't remember, one of those. She said she very vividly remembered him responding,
"You're so old."
and she thought that was actually just really funny because she asked him how old he was, and he was 49. So she was only at most 3 years his senior. And I think that just really attests to the way Donald Trump saw women of his own age at that time. It didn't bother E. Jean. She just laughed it off. And he then saw a lilac see-through piece of lingerie laying on a cabinet countertop. And he said,
"Ooh, how about this one?"
he picks it up and he held it up in front of E. Jean, kind of sizing her up in it. And he said,
"Yeah, I think it would fit you. Can you try this on for me?"
and so she told Donald Trump,
"No, I think you should try it on. It matches your eyes very clearly."
and so this was their banter. E. Jean thought this was fun banter. She continued to laugh, make jokes. They just kind of went back and forth about, "No, you try it on. No, I think you should try it on." There was a dressing room that was open and no attendants were around, so it looked as if you could just walk right in. And so as they moved in that direction, both telling each other, "No, you're going to try it on," it just felt natural to walk into the dressing room. And she said she was determined to get him to put it on over his clothes and that she thought this was going to be absolutely hilarious. But as she walked into the dressing room, before she could even realize what was happening, Donald Trump was closing the door abruptly behind himself, coming in behind her. And he had come at E. Jean with full force and shoved her body into the wall, where he put his shoulder in to lean his body weight in and hold her against the wall. Now, when he did this, her head actually hit the dressing room wall significantly hard. Like, it made a sound. And she says it really just threw her for a loop, and she just could not make sense of what the hell was even going on. She was just so confused, and they had just been laughing and bantering and having fun. And so she laughed because it was so wild and so confusing. Just hard to understand. She hadn't put it all together yet. Her brain hadn't caught up with what was going on. She didn't expect it in the least. She very thoroughly described how this was not expected at all, and that she laughed out of habit, that she's been a comic writer her whole life, and when you're uncomfortable, it's been typical for her to laugh in situations where maybe some people would think,
Why would you be laughing?
and that it may sound crazy because you're hearing the story now after you know what was happening. You know where he was going with that. She's saying,
I didn't at that time. I was so caught off guard, and I was so shocked that I just laughed out of nervousness and disbelief and also confusion.
and she says that within seconds, milliseconds even, he put his mouth on her mouth. And so she was sort of still laughing. She had continued to laugh a bit, but it was dawning on her at that moment what was occurring. And she was just shocked that he could go so quickly into that mode. And she said she knew just by instinct that, if you laugh at a man when he's being all sexy, like, that's not going to make him feel turned on. That's going to make him feel emasculated, or just very silly, like he's out of place, like he should not be doing this. Like this woman is not obviously into it. She's laughing at you. So that was part of her laughter as well. And so in one hand she had her purse, I don't know which hand, and the other hand she had free, and she was trying to push him back and get herself off the wall, but she was literally shoved up against it with all his body weight. Now, they were almost the same height on this day. Donald Trump stood at about 6'3". E. Jean Carroll was a pretty tall woman. However, she also had on huge, long heels this day that made her 6'1". So they were almost eye to eye. But Donald Trump had her beat by about 100 pounds at least. So his body weight being on her made it impossible for her to get out easily. So then ensued the struggle and what Eugene labeled as the fight. She pushed back at him, heading him back, pushing him back, just wriggling. That was not working. He had then started to put his hand up her skirt. She was wearing an all-black suit dress. And then, so he was reaching his hand up the bottom of that. Eugene said that he didn't ever get her tights all the way down, because at the same time she was trying her best to keep those tights on, because I think any woman would know what was at stake when those tights got removed. So he continued to pull very aggressively, with a lot of force, tried to rip them off of her, and eventually he got them down past her knees. He then stuck his hand up her skirt and felt around, she said rummaged around her private parts, genitalia, and then entered into her body. Eugene describes that moment as one that she'll never forget because it was so painful the way that it was done. It's one of the biggest reasons why she was never able to be intimate with a man again, was the memory of this pain in her body. Because, I hate telling this part, because when Donald Trump entered with his fingers, he didn't just go straight in, he curved his fingers very aggressively, curved them a lot, she said. And she said it hurt like hell, that it was excruciating. The next thing that Eugene remembers is that he took out his fingers and then he entered her body, at least partially, she's not sure, but some penetration occurred with his genitalia. She said that adrenaline was obviously running through her body, she believes, and she just thought in her mind, I have to get out of here, I have to win this fight. And she just wiggled and squirmed and pushed and stomped until she was able to finally get out from under him. And then she bolted out of the dressing room door, and she just kept fast walking, nearly, maybe shuffling, nearly jogging, without looking back. She said she has no idea whether or not Donald Trump even attempted to follow her. She said he didn't say anything. and she didn't look back. So she exited the store back out onto Fifth Avenue. That's the next thing she remembers, is being out on Fifth Avenue. And she described the seconds and the minutes right after escaping. In a quote, she said, "My overwhelming thought was I had died and I was somehow still alive." So I would say it's like that feeling when you come out of a dream and you're kind of like, was that real? Was that a dream? Something similar to that. I would assume she was meaning by that. That is very accurate to the feeling that we feel when in a traumatic situation, when we have dissociated a bit, our brain has kind of checked out a little because it's too overwhelming, especially when the adrenaline is pumping. That's a common thing that will happen. So that's a very accurate description of that. And then within 5 to 7 minutes of that happening, while she was still outside, she called her friend, Lisa Birnbach. And she said that she remembers that she was out of breath. And at this time, she was very much in shock. So she wasn't acting maybe how people would think is normal, but she was trying to rationalize what had just happened. And she admits openly, she was laughing. She was trying to talk through some sort of scenario. And this is what your brain does with cognitive dissonance in moments like these. She was trying to make sense of a scenario where this could maybe somehow be funny. Because if it was funny, then she wasn't wrong about the situation. She was right. It was just a funny thing. And she wouldn't be to blame for making that mistake and going into that dressing room, because at that time she felt like she really messed up. And, this is all very accurate to how victims tend to blame themselves. It has nothing to do with what is actually true, because that's definitely not her fault, whether she was laughing or not, or went into the dressing room or not. So just to make that clear, this is very typical victim thought process where they will blame themselves, because when something happens to you where your control is completely ripped away from you, you couldn't stop it from happening. You feel very violated and you feel out of control. And the only one way to reestablish that control is to blame yourself. It's counterproductive, but that's something that our brain and our emotions will do. So it happens a lot. So she was laughing and trying to run it by her friend. She said she's very emotional, out of breath, and she was just kind of saying like,
this just happened with Donald Trump of all people.
She didn't use the R word. She didn't want to call it that. She said that he had just put his fingers inside of her in the dressing room when they had been having a good time and laughing, and she didn't know why he did that. And she said her friend had said to her,
"This is not funny, Eugene. This isn't funny."
And then she said that her friend told her that she was R-worded, and she offered to take her to the police. And Eugene had said that she told her,
"No, I don't want to go to the police. I just want to go home. I want to take a bath, and I want to get in my bed, and I just want to be safe."
And she said that the reason that she didn't want to report it and she didn't ever go to police was because, 1, she did not think she would be believed. 2, she didn't want to believe it herself. And 3, she was afraid of Trump and his power. Anybody that went up against him, he went at them hard. And he had the power. He had done it before. He had the power to really ruin people's reputation, ruin their career, even if it could have been true. Whatever allegations you might take a look at. She knew he had a lot of money and that he had a lot of power, popularity, all of that. And she was afraid that also she would be looked at under a lot of scrutiny, and she didn't want anything to happen to her career. She then addressed the defamation claim directly, just describing for the jury the devastating impact that Trump's 2022 Truth Social post had on her career and her reputation and her life. She described the death threats she would get, the letters, the volume of all of that, the things that would be said in them, the fact that she had to get a firearm and she had to learn how to use it. She keeps it by her bed, and she was very afraid now at times in her own home, and just the way that it had just dramatically changed her entire world. Because of the first defamation, she was fired from her 27-year column with Elle magazine. And so to have him defame her again, it just brought all of that back up to the surface, and she had to go through all that hell again. The defense seemed to indicate they would be focusing a lot on the timing and her not knowing the exact date. So Carroll addressed it very openly in her statements. She said that initially she believed the incident happened in about 94, 95, but then she narrowed it down to early 1996 when she remembered, or it was brought to her attention by Lisa Birnbach, that Lisa had gone to interview Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago in January of 1996. And she knows that Lisa would have never attended that. And so that was when she knew that the attack happened in the early part of 1996. And another main point that she addressed during her time on the stand was an email that the defense was focusing on from 2017. And it was between her, Eugene Carroll, and Carol Martin, which was her other friend, the one she talked to a couple days later about the incident. And in this email, Carol Martin was urging E. Jean Carroll to come forward about what had happened to her in 96. And this was the year after the wave of women had come forward, after the Access Hollywood tapes were released. And Carol Martin specifically uses the words in the email that it is her patriotic duty to come forward about this. And the defense was attempting to categorize this as evidence that they were conspiring to take Trump down based on political affiliation. And so Carol just addressed this and said,
No, that wasn't me conspiring. That was my friend who knew about the incident telling me that it was my duty to the country to tell what really happened about the person who is now serving as our president, because they have a right to know someone that they elected as president has R-worded a woman.
And Carol said that this wasn't any conspiracy to hurt Trump in any way, that she actually never had any intention to do anything to Donald Trump. She just wanted him to stop lying about her and ruining her reputation and set the record straight. That was it. And at that point, the plaintiff testimony was done, and it was time for a cross-examination with Joe Tacopina. Okay, and he was ready. Okay. Tacopina's cross-examination was lengthy and at times pretty combative with E. Jean Carroll. There were moments that E. Jean became emotional from the amount of pressure that was being placed on her, the questions that were being heavily thrown at her, the hammering he was doing on certain details, not accepting her answers, and just being very combative. He did push her to tears at one point or maybe multiple points, and E. Jean had held it together pretty well up to that point, so if that's any indication of how hard he was weighing into her and wanting her to go through the very particular details of the incident, very explicit details of it. So it seemed that his reason for doing this, because he was getting very explicit at certain parts, was he believed that this would make Carol look less credible, that she would, back down or shy away in the face of those harsh details, explicit details. But she did not even flinch, actually, at those parts initially. She was very upfront. She was immediately responsive, and she answered everything very anatomically without batting an eye, just the way she had done just before in her own testimony, maybe a little more explicit at this point, because that's what he was pushing for. So this actually just kind of ended up making her look better and making him look kind of like a jerk. So it wasn't very likable to a jury. It was kind of gross. Like, why would you do that? Just going way too far at some parts, a lot of people felt. Then another part of the cross-examination was that Joseph Tacopina decided to hone in on a particular part of Carol's book, What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal. And it was a part where she wrote that all men should be sent to Montana for retraining. He was saying this to suggest that this demonstrated a general hostility towards men, which I really don't know why he felt the need to make a suggestion such as this. E. Jean Carroll wrote a book called What Do We Need Men For? And then she listed 21 different men that she felt were reprehensible and called it her list of hideous men. So I think it was safe to assume that she had some negative feelings about men, the hideous ones. So this wasn't really a point that needed to be made. But additionally, if you're familiar with the reference, it was a parallel that she was drawing between her book and the book by Jonathan Swift, which is called A Modest Proposal. Okay, and in that book, something similar happens. So it was a literary allusion, a little clever thing. Like, that's what the whole book was named. That was the whole point of the book. That was the whole premise of the title. Okay, so he was like making it more sinister. Like, she actually meant that men should all get rounded up and like shipped to Montana for real, for retraining, and she like hates men. Okay, and so it was satirical, clearly. And while Tacopina was making this point, the judge turned to the jury and interrupted to let them know that it was a satirical allusion to Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, because it was something so clear. E. Jean was very obvious about it in her title. Anyone who had never read that book or hadn't heard of it would obviously not be able to draw that conclusion and understand the satire. And so for Joe Tacopina to be framing it that way was just dishonest. And the judge had knowledge of this, so he needed to clear that up. And it was unclear of whether or not Joseph Tacopina was aware that he was being disingenuous with this information. But this thoroughly pissed Joseph Tacopina off so bad He was so angry that the judge had done that. He rose hell immediately. He was like,
You can't do that.
and the judge was just like,
Well, yeah, I can. Like, what do you mean?
and he accused the judge of bolstering Carroll's testimony to the jury. And he was so upset about this and so serious about this that the very next morning, he actually filed for a mistrial based on that comment, to which Judge Kaplan just wasn't playing around with the defense in this case. He wasn't playing around with anybody. He never did. He wasn't going to tolerate any of that crap. Like, no, you're going to have an honest trial. You're going to follow the rules, and we're not going to do any of this nonsense. Okay. So he just ignored it. He just denied the mistrial motion without comment. He just said no, and they moved on. And I love that. It's really funny when it's people that are constantly raising like bad faith arguments and stalling tactics and things like that, just like tricks, loopholes. It's always very satisfying to see them go up against a no-nonsense person of authority and watch them just fail at that horribly. You know, I mean, everybody, there's a little bit of like satisfaction in that for anybody, I feel. But Tacopina, he never really slowed down. He continued badgering and unflinching Carroll. Besides the moments that she did become emotional, she still stuck through it. And finally, cross-examination rested. And that ended on May 1st, 2023.
All rise.
On this day, they would be starting with the first outcry witness, which was going to be Lisa Birnbach, Carroll's friend that she had called directly after the incident. So first, she was up on the stand. She was being questioned by Roberta Kaplan, the plaintiff's lawyer. Now, Lisa Birnbach was a best-selling author and was one of Carroll's best friends for a long time. She gave her account of how she received Carroll that day. She said that Carroll called her completely out of breath and very emotional, and that she could tell that something very serious had happened. She said she did admit that Carroll was laughing, but it was like almost like a delirious laugh, like a shock laugh. And she could tell that something was very wrong. And she said that Carroll described to her without calling it that. She said she did not use that word, but that she actually then told Carroll, you need to go to the police. I'll take you. She offered to take her. And Carroll didn't want to go, so she didn't force the issue. Lisa also spoke to the fact that she had personally met Trump January of 1996, and that she would have never gone to that meeting had she heard about this any time prior to that. So she testified to the timing of the incident as well, corroborating that it was in 1996, sometime mid-year, maybe a little bit early in the year. And when she was asked, why are you testifying here today? She said, quote unquote, I'm here because I'm her friend and I want the world to know that she is telling the truth. Now on cross-examination with Tacopina, he pressed Birnbach on what are her political views and what is her idea of Trump and does she hate him and all of this, still really just going for that political motivation thing that it so obviously wasn't. And Lisa Birnbach was not holding back. She said that she pretty much despised Donald Trump, that she did not despise him before she heard about this incident, only after, and that her going there to interview him for a magazine was testament to that. So that brought her testimony to a close. And next up was Jessica Leeds on the stand. And then this was a witness to prior allegations. And so Leeds was then 81 years old. She was one of the first, or the furthest back incidents described of Donald Trump's sexual assault allegations. And she says that it happened in the late 70s. So she put it around 78 or 79, actually, when she was flying on a commercial flight. And she had coach tickets, but she had been bumped up to first class. And she remembered very much so because she was very excited. And she found herself seated right next to Donald Trump. So she was like, wow, this is so cool. And so she said that she found him very personable. It was a pleasant flight. She found him to be a pleasant seatmate. And so it wasn't until they came and cleared the dinner meal that was served when things took a wild turn that she had not seen coming. This was a quote from Leeds from her testimony. She says, he was trying to kiss me. He was trying to pull me towards him. He was grabbing my breasts. It's like he had 40 zillion hands. And it was a tussling match between the two of us. And then she said that she eventually made her way back to coach when she was able to get past him, and she felt flustered and shaken up and didn't know what to do. And she didn't tell anyone. She just left it the way it was. She said that she didn't speak out against Donald Trump for decades, and she actually saw Trump at an event later on, like a long time later, years later. And she says that at that time, he looked right at her and in front of other people referred to her as that "see you next Tuesday" from the plane. That's wild. Yeah, and I mean, that was an indication that he recognized her and knew exactly who she was. So then Carroll's team used Leeds' account to establish a pattern of behavior. And this was under Federal Rule 415, which is, unlike standard character evidence rules, this specifically allows propensity evidence in civil sexual assault claims. It's under the premise of did it once, likely did it again.
The White House continues to say none of this happened. Not only what you said didn't happen, but none of these women who have come forward with allegations about Donald Trump are telling the truth.
I don't really know how to answer that. As I said when I told my story, everybody's got a perfect right not to believe me because it happened so long ago. But I'm not bothered by being called a liar. But what I find interesting is the stories of those other, 14, 15 women, they're all the same. And none of them have colluded with each other. So this is an MO of this man. And just because they stand up there and say that we're lying, I don't think changes the situation at all.
I want to play something he said after you came out publicly and made the allegations that you did. This was what he said about that.
People that are willing to say, oh, I was with Donald Trump in 1980. I was sitting with him on an airplane. And he went after me on the plane. Yeah, I'm going to go after. Believe me, she would not be my first choice, that I can tell you.
I find that just ludicrous because he didn't pick me. I was there. I was available, and he was bored.
That's all it was.
That's all it was.
Now, on cross-examination with Tacopina, you can imagine what his tactic was, same one he'd been using. He said that her story was implausible, that wouldn't other people that were in first class notice what was going on, and, wouldn't other passengers or the flight attendants, where was everybody? Why didn't anyone know this was happening? He implied that this was all just political motivation that was backing this, and it was a false story. But Leeds just held firm to her story and continued to say that it was true. And that was the end of May 2nd for the trial.
All rise.
Now on May 3rd, the day began with the second prior act's witness, and that was Natasha Stoynoff. So Stoynoff was a former People magazine reporter, and she testified about an incident that happened in December of 2005 at Mar-a-Lago, where she was on assignment to go and interview Donald Trump and Melania Trump for their wedding anniversary. It was a piece that People magazine was doing on Donald Trump because he was a very successful businessman at the time, and he was on The Apprentice at this point. And Melania was actually pregnant with Barron Trump, ready to deliver any day now. She was just glowing. Okay, so that sets the stage. So Stoynoff was there getting pictures, photos, and interacting with the Trumps, getting their story, their love. Beautiful day, right? Well, at one point, she says Melania left the area that they were in to go upstairs for some reason, and then Donald Trump invited Natasha Stoynoff to view a specific room that he wanted to show her at Mar-a-Lago. And this is something that Trump has been reported to be doing all the time. Like, this is something that people always say happens at Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump likes to show people rooms or give them tours, even when it's not a sexual assault victim. It's literally just something he does all the time. Like, I've read so many stories of him doing this now at this point. Trump leads her into this room to show it to her, and as soon as they are in there with no one else, he shoves her up against a wall, pins her there, and begins to grope her and kiss her without asking. He starts putting his tongue in her mouth, she says, and she describes it as she freaked out. She started wriggling around and pushing him off, and he continued to try. She says that he said to her,
"We're going to have an affair, you know that, right?"
And then he made some type of comment about...
Aren't you familiar with what Marla said?
Marla Maples being his previous ex-wife, the second one, after Ivana. about something alluding to how she had at one point said that he was the best lover she ever had, I guess. I don't know how true that is, but he made reference to it to Stoynoff. And the only reason that she was able to escape is because a butler walked into the room. She was never sure if the butler saw exactly what was happening, but at that point Trump backed off and she was able to go out of the room. And shortly after she left the residence, she said it was very difficult to reconcile that had just happened. And she only told a select few people that she trusted at People magazine, the people that worked with her. But she did tell a pretty significant amount of people. But she was very afraid that it was going to get out and that it would end her career. And she felt like she had to release the story as it was supposed to be and not tell that part of what happened.
My name is Natasha Stoynoff. In 2005, I went to interview Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. At one point, Melania went upstairs to change her clothes for the next photo shoot. And Trump said to me, I want to show you this beautiful painting, this beautiful room. He leads me to this room, pushes me against the wall, and starts kissing me forcefully. I tried to push him. He kept coming back at me. I was in shock and smothered, and he had his hands here against my shoulders. I felt sick inside. I felt horrified. And thank goodness the butler charges into the room.
In response to a request for comment, the Trump campaign accused George Conway of Trump derangement syndrome and called the ad another sad, desperate attempt by Kamala's cronies to gaslight the American people. E. Jean Carroll and more than 24 women would beg to differ. Trump has repeatedly denied all accusations of sexual assault and has not faced criminal charges over any of the allegations other than E. Jean Carroll's civil case. Joining me now is Natasha Stoynoff and George Conway, president and executive director of the Anti-Psychopath PAC and co-host of the George Conway Explains It All podcast. Thank you both for being here. I do want to go to you first, Natasha, because you are a journalist. Because you're a journalist, you're part of what you do professionally is observe. And so as you observed Donald Trump then and you observed him now, would you describe him as a predator? Would you describe him as somebody who you feared might actually sexually assault you as he did E. Jean Carroll? Tell me in that moment what you feared the end game was had that butler not intervened.
I never thought of him as a predator at that time. And that's why I was fine to be in a room alone with him. But it occurred to me after the incident that that was the first time I was ever in the room alone with him. I'd interviewed him several times, but had always been surrounded by publicists, managers, and there was no reason for me to really think anything untoward would happen being in the room alone with him.
But once it did, and then when you later heard, you go back many years later, and you heard him in that Access Hollywood video, which was recorded, I think, the same year that what happened to you happened, where he said, when I see a beautiful woman, I just kiss. I don't even wait. And then he said, you can do anything when you're famous. You can grab them by the, which is what he did to E. Jean Carroll. When you heard that tape, thinking about what happened to you, what did you think?
It's weird. I felt a combination of relief, which may sound odd, but that's because I had been blaming myself for what had happened. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, he just does this with everybody. And I felt horrified because, number one, of what he was saying he did, and number two, I worried that had I spoken up earlier, perhaps I could have prevented some assaults.
And then just to make things even darker, there was a video clip of Donald Trump publicly denying this allegation from Stoynoff as well. And it's very similar to the one with Leeds, and it's very similar to the one about Carroll.
Then there was a writer from People magazine who wrote a story on Melania and myself on our first anniversary. The story was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was lovely. But last night we hear that after 12 years, this took place 12 years ago, this story, a new claim that I made inappropriate advances during the interview to this writer. And I ask a very simple question. Why wasn't it part of the story that appeared 20 or 12 years ago? Why wasn't it part of the story? Why didn't they make it part of the story?
Why did you wait so long? Why didn't you do it then?
I was one of the biggest stars on television with The Apprentice, and it would have been one of the biggest stories of the year. Think of it. She's doing a story on Melania, who's pregnant at the time, and Donald Trump, our one-year anniversary. And she said, I made inappropriate advances. And by the way, the area was a public area, people all over the place. Take a look. You take a look. Look at her words. You tell me what you think. I don't think so. I don't think so.
Same thing. How many people do you know who have even one woman saying they were sexually assaulted by them, and that person responds to that by saying,
Would be her. She's not the one I would pick.
that's so odd in and of itself. Now, how many people do you know that have more than one woman doing that? And that's the way they respond to it, identically. It's just, come on, like, that's wild. I think that just says so much. It's exactly how the person that I can see Donald Trump is very easily, that I don't understand why much of the world or country cannot also see exactly who and how he is. It's exactly what I would expect someone of that nature to respond to true allegations. So it just really, to me, it just speaks to his guilt. But okay. So Carroll's team drew the conclusion of wrapping these up, where it was drawing the pattern. All three women were attacked in a semi-public place where they were somehow secluded off in a way, and then suddenly confronted with this assault that they didn't see coming. It's very abrupt. There's no permission asked. It's just boom, it's on you and you have to accept it or get away. And then denying everything when that woman comes forward and insulting her appearance and making her out to be not credible. Pattern. It's a pattern. And for this one, I'm not certain if Tacopina cross-examined her, but if so, it wasn't super notable. It was very similar to Leeds. And then still on May 3rd, after Natasha's testimony, there was still time. And the next thing that Carroll's team did was bring forth Donald Trump's deposition tapes. And they began to play extended clips of Donald Trump speaking for himself on each bit of trial evidence. And so we're going to go through some of those because this tape was arguably the number one incriminating piece of evidence to incriminate Donald Trump himself, because he did not do so well in these. It's actually just something that I feel like you see in a trial and you just never forget it, because he just so perfectly or imperfectly, for his case, just incriminated himself. So it's just something I'll never forget. So I want to show you exactly what I mean. I don't know if Donald Trump understood that he was admitting to these things all throughout this deposition, but that's what he was doing.
In your June 21 statement, which is DJT 20, you said that Ms. Carroll was trying to sell a new book, and that you said shame on those who make up false stories of assault to try to get publicity for themselves or sell a book.
No. That's right.
Before you made that statement, did you have any knowledge, one way or the other, of the financial arrangements between Ms. Carroll and the publisher of her book?
No.
Did you even know who her publisher was?
No.
Had you ever seen her book contract?
No.
Did you know anything about Ms. Carroll's financial situation?
No.
Did you know anything about her expected book sales?
No idea.
Before you made the statement that appears in DJT 20, do you know whether you or anyone working for you did any research on Ms. Carroll?
I just don't know. It's possible somebody, when they heard this horrible accusation, it's possible that somebody did a little quick research, but not that I know of.
Another thing that you say in your June 21 statement is that Ms. Carroll was trying to carry out a political agenda.
Yeah.
Before issuing your statement on June 21, did you learn what political party Ms. Carroll belonged to?
I didn't know that.
Before you issued your June 21 statement, did you have any documents indicating that she was pursuing a political agenda?
No.
At the end of your statement, your June 21 statement, you say, if anyone has information that the Democratic Party is working with Ms. Carroll or New York Magazine, please notify us as soon as possible. Did anyone ever notify you?
I don't know.
Sitting here today, you can't recall anyone who notified you?
I don't know, yeah.
Just wild. She asked him from what time to what time were you married to your first wife and your second wife? And not only did he not know the dates, he couldn't even tell you the year. He wasn't sure exactly the year that he married his first wife and when he divorced her and when he started his relationship with Marla. And then when that ended, he didn't know. And there was a strategy to this. It was to prove that you can't really scrutinize someone for not remembering an exact date of something that happened a long time ago when you yourself can't remember a seemingly very important date of when you married or divorced your wives. So you married those people, right? It doesn't mean that you didn't marry them. It doesn't mean that you didn't divorce them just because you can't remember it. So E. Jean Carroll not remembering the exact date that you assaulted her doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That's where she was going with that. She was demonstrating that people don't remember exact dates of things sometimes. Okay? So that's what that was for. I thought that was very smart. Additionally, there were many parts of this deposition where Trump really showed his contempt and his hatred, his anger for Roberta Kaplan, and just overall anger at all of the women who have come forward and anyone who goes against him for legal matters. Some of that starts to spill out.
Okay, then you go on to say in the statement, and while I am not supposed to say it, I will. Why were you not supposed to say it?
Because it's not politically correct to say, read the next, go ahead, that she's not my type. Yeah, because it's not politically correct to say it, and I know that, but I'll say it anyway. She's accusing me of rape. A woman that I have no idea who she is. It came out of the blue. The worst thing you can do, the worst charge, and you know it's not true too. You're a political operative also. You're a disgrace. But she's accusing me, and so are you, of rape, and it never took place. And I will tell you, I made that statement, and I said, while it's politically incorrect, she's not my type, and that's 100% true. She's not my type.
And do you recall speaking about Ms. Leeds' allegations at campaign events in 2016?
I might have. I thought it was so, like your client, I thought it was so ridiculous. You wouldn't be a choice of mine either, to be honest with you. I hope you're not insulted. I would not, under any circumstances, have any interest in you. I'm honest when I say it. I would not have any interest in.
The video we just watched, where you talked about Ms. Leeds. What else did you know about Ms. Leeds that would indicate to you that she would not have been your first choice, other than how she looked?
I don't know. I think I probably saw her on television or something. But I don't want to be insulting. But when people accuse me of something, I think I have a right to be insulting because they're insulting me. They're doing the ultimate insult. They make up stories, and then I'm not allowed to speak my mind. No, I disagree with that. No, she would not have been anywhere on a list. I just wouldn't have been for me. It's disgusting. It's what she said was disgusting. Can you imagine doing that on an airplane? What she said? I'm doing that on an airplane. That's almost as ridiculous as doing it in Bergorf Goodman in a dressing room.
You say as follows. The world should know what's really going on. It is a disgrace, and people should pay dearly for such false accusations. You see that?
Yeah.
And the person you meant who should pay dearly for such false accusations was E. Jean Carroll, correct?
Yeah, and I think their attorneys, too. I think the attorneys like you are a big part of it, because you know it's a phony case.
And then this is the really shoot yourself in the foot moment for Trump in this deposition, and it's in regard to the Access Hollywood tape. So when Roberta Kaplan plays the tape for him again, he's obviously already said,
This is such old news. This has already been litigated.
It's pretty clear by the way that Donald Trump answered these questions that he didn't understand what was being proven here, that he didn't understand where Roberta Kaplan was going with this or why it was relevant. But his answers definitely demonstrated something very significant to this trial. So check it out.
Please
This is very old news, fully litigated during debates, during everything else, fully litigated. Okay. And you know what I said then, and I say it now? Locker room talk. Locker room talk. That was locker room talk.
Okay.
That's what goes on.
And you did say in the video that you, quote, moved on her heavily, correct?
Excuse me?
You do say in the video that you, quote, moved on her heavily.
I did say that, yes, okay. Absolutely.
And you do say in the video that as part of trying to have sex with this woman, you took her furniture shopping, correct?
We actually did look for furniture, yes.
So that was true. You actually took this woman
I
dancing.
think so.
for
It's been a long time ago. It's how long was that? A long time ago. But I think so. I do think so.
Is that the only occasion when you took a woman shopping?
I think so.
Huh?
And you say, and again, this has become very famous in this video, I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the you can do anything. That's what you said, correct?
Well, historically, that's true with stars.
It's true with stars that they can grab women by the
Well, that's what it's. If you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true. Not always, but largely true. Unfortunately or fortunately.
And you consider yourself to be a star?
I think you can say that, yeah.
And now you said before, a couple of minutes ago, that this was just locker room talk.
It's locker room talk.
And so does that mean that you didn't really mean it?
No, it's locker room talk. I don't know. It's just the way people talk.
As if all of that weren't bad enough, this next moment, I think, in my opinion, is the worst moment for him. It is where he makes the worst mistake that impacts the entire case. I believe the hardest, for sure. It's such a blunder that for the plaintiff side is like gold. The unbelievable nature of this blunder that Trump makes here is just catastrophic for him. It's just crazy. Let's take a look.
You say, and this is the Litvin tweet, I never met this person in my life.
Yes.
Was that a true statement when you made it on June 21, 2019?
It was a true statement when I made it. I think subsequently, or at some point, they showed a picture on a receiving. I was on a celebrity line for a charity, and I think I was either shaking her hand or her husband's hand on a receiving line. Like I say, shake a lot of hands with people, but I had no idea who she was.
So if I can understand your testimony, sir, you're saying that at the time you made the statement that's in DJT 20, you were not aware of ever having met Ms. Carroll. You have since seen a photograph that shows you with Ms. Carroll on a receiving line. Correct?
Along with a lot of other people. This was a very public, I think it was a charity or a celebrity event or something. And I think that's her big claim to fame, you know, that she shook my hand at some celebrity event.
Are you okay?
So the answer to my question is yes, that after you made the statement, you became aware that there's a photo of you with Ms. Carroll in a receiving line, correct?
At some point,
okay.
I saw there was a photo on a receiving line, yes.
Okay, let's mark the photo. What number are we at? What?
23.
You have in front of you a black and white photograph that we've marked as DJT 23. And I'm going to ask you, is this the photo that you were just referring to?
I think so, yes.
Okay. And do you recall when you first saw this photo?
At some point during the process, I saw it. That's, I guess, her husband, John Johnson, who was an anchor for ABC. Nice guy, I thought. I mean, I don't know him, but I thought he was pretty good at what he did. I don't even know who the woman. Let's see. I don't know who. It's Marla.
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla. Yeah, that's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to?
No, that's
Here.
Carroll.
Oh, is that?
The person you just pointed to was
I
E. Jean
see.
Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
Point, your wife.
And the woman on the right is your then wife,
I don't know.
Ivana?
This was the picture. I assume that's John Johnson. Is that
That's Carroll?
Because it's very blurry.
Now, just to make it very clear what happened there, because it's easy to miss if you've only seen it one time. Donald Trump is looking at this photo right here. Okay, that's E. Jean Carroll, Ivana Trump, Donald Trump, and John Johnson, which is Carroll's husband at the time that this photo was taken. For the minutes leading up to this moment, Donald Trump and Roberta Kaplan, E. Jean's lawyer, are discussing this photo. Roberta Kaplan asks him if he recalls the photo that he was seen in with E. Jean Carroll. He discusses the photo. He talks about how her husband at the time was also in the photo. He seems to understand what the photo is and where it came from and who is in it, right? And then they put the photo in front of him. He's looking at the photo, and then he strangely points at the photo.
That's, I guess, her husband, John Johnson, who was an anchor for ABC. Nice guy, I thought. I mean, I don't know him, but I thought he was pretty good at what he did. I don't even know who the woman. Let's see. I don't know who.
Now, if you look at the photo, it's kind of a side view of this person. She's a little bit turned. You can't see her face completely, okay? But at some point, he says,
It's Marla.
It's Marla.
At that moment, Roberta Kaplan is kind of taken aback. She's like,
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla. Yeah, that's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing?
His lawyer quickly hops in to the frame and says, no, that's E. Jean Carroll.
No, that's
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
You can see that he is pointing at E. Jean Carroll, identifying her as Marla Maples.
Oh, is that,
The person you just pointed to was
I
E. Jean
see.
Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
First point, your wife.
And then he starts to say a bunch of things to kind of divert the attention from what just happened. Roberta Kaplan says,
Did you just identify E. Jean Carroll as Marla Maples?
and after that, he doesn't really have much of an answer for that. He says something about the photo being blurry.
It's a blurry photo.
Suddenly, it's a blurry photo that they've been discussing for all this time now. He never once said it's blurry until now. So what is very obvious is that E. Jean Carroll looked enough like Marla Maples, in this photo at least, for someone who was married to Marla Maples to confuse the two in the photo, okay? And the rest is speculation, because you could never know. But what it seems happened, Donald Trump knows that E. Jean Carroll is in this photo. He knows that. So if he thought that was Marla, then he had to have believed that the first person that he was identifying, the other woman in the photo, was E. Jean Carroll, which is why he was like,
I don't recognize that person.
he must have thought that was E. Jean Carroll and that the other woman was his wife, when it was actually the other way around. But Marla wasn't even in the photo at all. That was actually Ivana Trump. Well, Roberta Kaplan doesn't hammer into him at that moment, but she realizes what just happened. And later,
When you said that Ms. Carroll was not your type, you meant that she was not your type physically, right?
I saw her in a picture. I didn't know what she looked like. And I said it, and I say it with as much respect as I can, but she is not my type.
And again, when you say type, you just refer to looking at photos, so you mean physically she's not your type.
Physically, she's not my type, and now that I've gotten indirectly to hear things about her, she wouldn't be my type in any way, shape, or form.
But when you were talking back on June 24th, you were referring to her not being your type physically.
I
correct?
saw a photo of her,
Okay.
and the only difference between me and other people is I'm honest. She's not my type.
I take it the three women you've married are all your type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
out, I think that E. Jean Carroll probably was his type. Because he was able to confuse her with Marla Maples, someone he was married to. So I think that means that she probably resembles Marla Maples and probably was precisely his type. So making those statements, again, incorrect, lies. It really blew the lid right off of his poor excuse for why he wouldn't have done these things. This thing that he had in some form or another repeated about nearly every victim that had come forward up to now, where he attacks their appearance and looks down upon them about their physical looks in a way as to say,
I would never touch that person. I would never do that with them. Wow. Not me. They're beneath me.
It really blew the lid off of that and really revealed that that's just a tactic, that that's just something he says that isn't true, that he says to seem like he's not guilty of what is being accused of him, because E. Jean Carroll clearly was his type, because he confused her with Marla Maples, who he married. Oopsies. In summary, this deposition was a train wreck for Donald Trump and his side of the case, because it was just brutal. He was so caught up the entire time with insulting Roberta Kaplan, all his anger and his vitriol towards her, and his insulting E. Jean Carroll and talking about all of the people that are coming at him and how he's the victim of these things. He was so caught up in all of that. He just stuck his foot in his mouth so many times, so many repeated times. He wasn't able to be on his game, I guess, so to speak, to even be able to realize when he was incriminating himself so blatantly. He testified to blatant acts of defamation, which he is on trial for. It's like, do you understand what you're on trial here for today? And I think that this pattern that was seen in this deposition, his inability to prioritize what was important, I think is the entire reason that he could never have been put on the stand. His counsel was never going to put him on the stand because it would have been maybe even worse. So it did not go well for him. But it was a big win for E. Jean Carroll, and much deserved. And I mean, he did it to himself. He did it to himself. What better evidence is there than that? One could argue that it didn't all by itself definitively prove the sexual assault, but it did definitively prove, by his own words, the defamation, hands down. He testified openly that the things that he said about her doing something just to sell a book, about her motivations politically, all of those things, he testified openly that he had no knowledge of any of that. He had no knowledge of E. Jean Carroll. He did not know anything about her. He made those comments without knowing any single thing about her or her financial situation at all. That is defamation, period. That is what he was on trial for, and that is what he admitted to. I don't know that he understood he admitted to it, but he did. That was in the bag. And then the even worse part is that he never stopped defaming her. He defamed her multiple times after that. He defamed her during this trial. So his entire taped deposition is, I don't think, available to the public, but most of the main highlights are. You can check that out on YouTube or wherever. Now, oddly, on this day, at some point, I'm not too sure exactly the precise time, Tacopina randomly stands up and lets the judge know that they will not be calling any witnesses for their side of the case when it's their turn, and that Trump will not be testifying in person officially, because it was still open for him to do so. Typically, this would be something that would be stated when it's their turn to go, which wasn't going to be until the next day. There were still witnesses to go for the plaintiff's case in chief. So this was a little odd. It almost seemed like an anxious, preemptive admission so that it wouldn't be so striking or awkward the moment that the defense's turn to go came upon them, and then they had to say that. So that's the only thing that people speculated. The judge was quite surprised. Tacopina explained that their one expert witness that they did have coming or initially wanted to bring in had health problems and was not able to testify. So they didn't have anyone. The judge just kind of said,
okay, well, are you sure?
Basically saying, like, are you sure Trump doesn't want to come here and, look the jury in the eye and to stand by his side of the case? Are you positive that he does not want to testify? He's forfeiting his right to testify. And they said yes. So the judge, trying to be certain, gave them extra time and said that if he wanted to testify still, he could, but he needed to file that motion and let them or request that by the 7th, May 7th. So Tacopina said he would let him know, and that was understood. So then it was the end of the day, so nothing more took place that day.
All rise.
They then returned on May the 4th, and the first witness of that day was Carroll Martin. So this is going to be E. Jean's second friend that she confided in shortly after the incident. Now, Carroll Martin was a veteran television anchor on the news, and she testified that Carroll had confided in her after the assault. And when asked when she recalled this happening, she said sometime between 1994 and 1996. So that corroborated the timeline that was estimated by Lisa Birnbach and also E. Jean Carroll. Martin described Carroll as sounding agitated when she was telling the story and pretty anxious, but not crying at the time. She said that it felt like E. Jean Carroll was not providing exhaustive detail, but it was very clear to Carroll Martin that E. Jean was upset by what had happened, even though she described it as a fight and not the R word. Martin did confirm that what was described was the R word. And she said that E. Jean Carroll also told her on that conversation that she had told Lisa Birnbach, so that corroborated that story. And so then when Tacopina cross-examined Carroll Martin, he was really pressing on that 2017 email. And Carroll Martin had the exact same story. She said that they were never scheming against Trump, that the patriotic duty she was speaking about was that the American people needed to know what someone that they elected president was capable of, what he had done, and that she should come out and talk about it. now's the time, especially now. I mean, this man is going to get away with all of that. I mean, so many women had come forward already. It was going to take a lot more, apparently. Just like Carroll said in her other interview, it takes a lot of women coming forward for such a powerful man to actually finally be taken out of that power. So that's what she was talking about. Now, Martin's testimony offered some slightly different aspects to the case and to E. Jean's story in contrast to Lisa Birnbach's. Because Carroll Martin testified that when she met with E. Jean that night at her home, and they talked, she said they talked for about an hour in her kitchen about the incident, where E. Jean was kind of all over the place about it. She was seemingly not wanting to say what it really was. She was hesitant, she was agitated, she was anxious, but she was clearly, once it came out, describing what Carroll Martin testified to as to be a sexual assault, R-word, done by Donald Trump. Same story. But the difference with Carroll Martin is that she testified that she told E. Jean straight out,
don't tell anyone. Don't come forward with the story. Don't report this.
And now the timeline of this is so important because it was a little difficult to explain in the context of 2023 why someone, your friend, would come to you and tell you that they have been R-worded by somebody, and you would tell them, don't come forward, don't report it. That didn't seem plausible to someone if they were just thinking about the time period of right now, of 2023, where they were. But what needed to be considered was when it actually happened, which was 1996. And Carroll Martin was asked straight out, why did you give that advice? And her response was one of the most human moments of the trial. She expressed genuine remorse and regret looking back, and she explained that she has asked herself that question 1,000 times over the years. And she said she had told Carroll back then,
Donald Trump has tons of lawyers and tons of money, and he will bury you. Don't do that. Don't say anything.
And she said she thinks that the reason that she did that is because it was true. It was true. And that now, even though she understands that at that time, that's the way it was for women, she wishes she would have been more brave and told E. Jean to come forward and that she would be by her side. She explained that this tied into her tone and where she was coming from in that 2017 email, when things had changed. Times had changed for women, and the Me Too movement was in full blossom, and it was a time when women could come forward and possibly be believed and possibly have a chance at justice, unlike 1996. When commenting about Carroll Martin's testimony in that part in particular, Roberta Kaplan is quoted saying,
the truth is that in 1996, it wasn't bad advice. Had E. Jean gone to the Manhattan DA's office in 1996 with this story, the chances that anything would have come of it are extremely low. And we all know that Donald Trump is a vengeful, vicious person. And Carroll was right.
Carroll being Carroll Martin. So there you have it. So that context of the story just really added an extra touch of credibility that moved right along with the timeline, that corroborated the timeline, that made perfect sense. You'd have to think of, if I wanted to believe that this story was not true, then I would have to accept and believe that these women, two women who had extremely reputable, long-spanning careers in the public eye, were well-respected women, no ties to Donald Trump whatsoever, were just willing to come up with this false, phony story to come to trial and testify for E. Jean Carroll, and that from the time that they were interviewed back in 2019, when E. Jean Carroll first came out with this story, would have had to keep their story perfectly aligned, without waver, without ever making a mistake, to make it believable that they actually heard it back in 1996, with all of these details that they all had in common, that they all never wavered from or seemed to blunder with at all. That's quite an illogical and wild thing to think could have happened. The much more plausible explanation is that it happened exactly the way it's being described, and that was very evident to the jury. Up next on the stand was Dr. Leslie Lebowitz, the psychologist that talked with E. Jean and evaluated her for evidence of some kind of a trauma of this nature. So this was a damages witness, and she was a clinical psychologist specializing in general trauma and sexual trauma. So she testified that she evaluated Carroll for the case and that she found 3 categories of harm to be present. 1 was painful, intrusive memories that had lasted for years. 2 was that there had been a significant diminishment in Carroll's self-concept and her self-worth. And 3, profound avoidance behavior, which was most visible in her near complete withdrawal from all romantic and intimate relationships from that day forward. A quote from Dr. Lebowitz during her testimony reads as follows. She manifests very notable avoidance symptoms, which have curtailed her romantic and intimate life and caused profound loss. She has suffered for many years and what amounts to decades of living essentially alone. That's so sad. Dr. Lebowitz testified that Carroll did not meet the full diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but that sub-threshold PTSD symptoms, combined with the depressive and avoidant patterns she described, were nonetheless very consistent with the kind of lasting harm that would have been caused by sexual assault. She noted Carroll visibly squirming a lot during session when describing the specific physical details of the assault. And that was what she described as intrusive re-experiencing of the event. Those are just some highlights. There was much more, but those were the main points and some of the most compelling testimony. The next up that day, they were sailing right through these witnesses. The next witnesses were the former Bergorf Goodman employees. So 2 former Bergorf Goodman employees testified during Carroll's case in chief, and their primary purpose was to rebut Trump's claim that was made public in his own deposition that he rarely shopped at Bergorf Goodman. So if you will recall, Donald Trump, in his very first statement publicly, which he did an official government statement to respond to Carroll's initial essay back in 2019, he said specifically that Bergorf Goodman had stated that they did not have any surveillance of the act. Okay, so now when he's being asked in this deposition, he is admitting outwardly, openly, that he never spoke with anyone from Bergorf Goodman.
So before you made your statements that it never happened in 2019, did you or anyone on your staff reach out to anyone at Bergorf Goodman?
I didn't have to reach out to anybody because it didn't happen. And by the way, if it did happen, it would have been reported within minutes. Talking about going to a major floor, probably, I assume, the most important floor, a major floor in a major department store. That's a very busy store, by the way.
After you made the statements that you made in June of 2019, did you or anyone working for you reach out to Bergorf Goodman?
After the statement was made, no.
He implied in that statement that he spoke to someone from Bergorf Goodman, and they confirmed that they had no surveillance of the act happening. So that never happened. So he was definitely making that statement maliciously and falsely, and he was aware of it because he knows that he never spoke to anyone from Bergorf Goodman. Okay, so that's what she was establishing here. Also, the other thing that she was asking is, do you shop there often?
Did you ever have occasion to go to the department store Bergorf Goodman?
Very rarely.
You say very rarely. Can you give me more detail? How rarely?
I mean, almost, for me, almost never. I would very rarely go there.
When you went there, what do you recall shopping for?
I don't know. It's possible I was there, but I don't know that I ever shopped there for myself.
So when you shopped there for yourself, to the extent you went there, you were shopping for others?
I don't think I ever shopped for others. It's possible that one or both of my wives shopped there a little bit, but I don't remember ever buying something for myself at Bergorf Goodman. I went there very seldom, if ever.
He acted as though he never shops there. A former Bergorf Goodman manager testified that Trump was a well-known customer and a recognizable customer who had shopped at the store multiple times during the mid-1990s, which was the time period in question. And another very important part that came out was that same manager testified that dressing rooms in the lingerie department were often left unattended. That often that floor would be exactly left that way, the way that Carroll had described, that at that time of day, during that period of time on that floor, there often would not be many shoppers. There would be no one maybe up there, and that they would actually purposefully leave a dressing room open so that if anyone did end up there, they could still try things on. So that was a big deal because a lot of people wanted to speculate and wanted to assume that the story was not believable because how could there be nobody there? How could there be nobody around? Turns out it was very plausible. So next up on the witness stand was Professor Ashlee Humpreys. And she was a reputation damages expert. Humpreys was a Northwestern University communications professor, and she was called to the stand to quantify the harm to Carroll's reputation that was caused by Trump's October 2022 Truth Social post, the specific statement that formed the basis of her defamation case in this trial, Carroll II. So she used what she called an impression model to calculate how many people had seen the statement and then how many of those people were likely to have believed it. And so Humpreys concluded that Trump's post generated between 85.8 and 104 million impressions, and that a reputational repair campaign would cost between $368,000, that's a low estimate, and $2.76 million. That's the high estimate. And she testified that this was a very conservative analysis that she did. So, well, during cross-examination, Tacopina aggressively challenged her methodology, noting that she had never actually run a reputation repair campaign before, that her estimate had an error range of over 86%, and that Carroll's name recognition, and arguably her fame, had actually increased significantly since 2019. And then these critiques were later echoed in Trump's post-trial motions, even though the court ultimately rejected them. All right, and then next up on the stand was Roberta Meyers, and she is the former editor-in-chief for Elle magazine. So Meyers, Carroll's former boss at Elle magazine, testified as the final witness for Carroll's case. She described Carroll as a beloved columnist with a very devoted readership who had contributed to their magazine for 27 years. Meyers' role in her testimony for E. Jean Carroll was to establish that there was a significant reputation on the table prior to Trump's defamation that stood to be damaged. That what Donald Trump said and did about E. Jean Carroll that was not accurate information did damage to something that was tangible, to something that was known and seen and felt and existed. So her testimony that E. Jean Carroll was a beloved columnist for 27 years. Now, this being the editor-in-chief at the magazine that ended up firing her because of this. They let her go because of the media backlash that they apparently did not want to be a part of, and the president coming for her name. And so her role was to demonstrate that Carroll had a reputation that stood to be damaged, a good one, a spotless one, a beloved one. And also impart her testimony that she never once knew about this case, this incident at all from E. Jean Carroll, who she worked side by side with very closely as her editor-in-chief for 27 years, had never heard anything about this until the day that it was released in New York Magazine with the rest of the world. And so that was to demonstrate that this really was a secret that E. Jean Carroll had kept within her, besides in the two people that she had confided in, Lisa Birnbach and Carol Martin, her friends. She had not been out plotting and spreading this rumor and conniving and trying to spread this all around town and get attention and do all these things that the defense was making up about her. She had not been doing that at all. She hadn't been speaking about it. It was a secret, something that she was ashamed of, something that she tried to push down and forget about, but she just couldn't. So that testimony was quite powerful. And then with the end of that testimony, on May the 4th, the plaintiff's case rested formally. There was no need to move on to traditionally what would be the defense's case in chief now happening, because the judge was already informed that there would be none. There was not one, and the defense then formally rested immediately as well. So because Judge Kaplan had offered to Donald Trump that he could have until May 7th to decide to change his mind and come and testify in person in front of the jury, just like E. Jean Carroll had done, they had to wait now for that day. So the trial did not continue for the next few days because they were waiting to give Donald Trump that opportunity. And Donald Trump ended up not taking that opportunity. He did not testify. And so everyone returned to court on May 8th for closing arguments.
All rise.
Carroll's attorneys hammered the absence throughout the closing arguments. Roberta Kaplan took the stage, so to speak, for the plaintiff's closing. And Kaplan's closing was structured around the contrast between Carroll's 11 witnesses and Trump's empty chair. She walked the jurors through that deposition video again, all of those incriminating statements that he made, just flat out. She replayed the Access Hollywood exchange, and then returned to what she called the defining pattern. Leeds on an airplane in 1979, Carroll in a dressing room in 1996, and Stoynoff at Mar-a-Lago in a private room in 2005. Each time it's a semi-public place, a sudden grab, and then a categorical denial after. She pointed to Trump's misidentification of Carroll as Marla Maples as evidence that the man who said Carroll was not his type had met her and knew her, and apparently found her attractive enough to confuse her with his ex-wife, Marla Maples, period. She called Trump's 2022 statement, calling Carroll a liar and calling the claims a con job, demonstrably false, and made with full awareness that it was false, since Trump admitted in his own deposition that he had read nothing, checked nothing, and had done zero research before making it. This is a quote from Roberta Kaplan during closing arguments. She says, "That's who Donald Trump is. That is how he thinks, and that's what he does. He thinks he can get away with it here. He didn't even bother to show up here in person." And then she urged the jurors to consider what it means to live decades without companionship, without someone to cook dinner with, to walk your dog with, to watch TV with, feeling for decades like you are somehow dirty and unworthy, or unable to trust somebody. Kaplan also declined to suggest a specific damages number, telling the jurors just to consider the evidence and to pick a number that they think is right. She repeated that this lawsuit is not about money, that this lawsuit is about getting her name back. And at that, the plaintiff's side rested, and it was now Joseph Tacopina's turn to close it out for the defense. So his closing leaned on the absence of physical evidence and what he characterized as the inherent implausibility of Carroll's account. He told the jury that the setting made no sense, that Trump, a man with everything to lose, would never risk assaulting a woman. He attacked the fact that the exact date was never known, just arguing that Carroll had tailored her testimony to fit a timeline only after the fact. He dismissed the Access Hollywood tapes as locker room talk again. He argued that Leeds' story was just physically impossible, given that there were other passengers on the plane. And then he argued that all three women, Carroll, Leeds, and Stoynoff, had just coordinated their stories, driven by their political hatred for Trump. He urged jurors not to let Carroll profit to the tune of millions of dollars by making them hate Trump enough to ignore facts. A quote from Tacopina during his closing was,
"What could I have asked Donald Trump? Where were you on some unknown date 27 or 28 years ago? Instead, what they want is for you to hate him enough to just ignore facts."
Okay. And Mike Ferreira was a co-counsel for Carroll, and he offered the plaintiff's rebuttal. He reminded jurors that Trump had every opportunity to go ahead and take the stand. He could have looked them in the eye and denied the allegations in person, but he chose not to, even when given extra time. And so he told jurors that they were permitted to draw an adverse inference from Trump's absence. Well, the jury only deliberated for less than 3 hours before they returned their verdict. By a preponderance of evidence, they found Donald J. Trump liable for sexual abuse, battery. Specifically, the jury found Trump digitally penetrated Carroll without consent. That means with his fingers, constituting sexual abuse under New York law. The jury did not find specifically by New York law at the time, the R word, as defined under the narrow 1996 New York law definition, which required penile penetration, had been proven by a preponderance of evidence, but did find that the assault occurred. There was a lot of speculation as to why that was the case, because Carroll clearly did testify that she was penetrated with that as well. So juries don't explain their reasoning, but they did find that there was enough evidence that he did penetrate her with his fingers. So by common definition, anyone would call that R word. Whether New York definition defined it that way or not, but they could not call it that in the case. However, New York updated their law since then and have now included other forms of R word as R word legally because of this case, because that was ridiculous and preposterous. But the other part is, why didn't they find that there was enough evidence for that part if they found that he did penetrate her with his fingers? And they don't answer that question. So, I mean, I can only speculate, but I would assume maybe that it was because of Carroll's bit of uncertainty surrounding that part. She had a little bit of uncertainty about whether he put it all the way in, partially in. She wasn't looking down at it, and she had no idea how well or not well endowed Donald Trump was. Given that there was that bit of uncertainty regarding that particular part of it and that law being so strict, they felt that they had to let that charge go, and that there was so much more detailed description surrounding the digital penetration, which would only constitute, under that faulty, very strict New York law, to be sexual abuse, and not specifically our word. But as a woman, and coming from even the judge, and I think anyone being honest with themselves would say that we all understand that it doesn't matter what you're penetrated with. If you are penetrated against your will, that is our word. And the judge acknowledged this in his follow-ups about the case, despite whatever the New York law might have said at the time. And people tend to want to really skip over that and really hammer home that, like,
no, it's just convenient. They didn't find it for that charge.
Shut up. If you really want to draw the difference between our word and sexual assault because he digitally penetrated her, and you want to say,
well, that's not our word, and he didn't get
it. Shut up. That's all I have to say to you. Shut the hell up. Next on the list was the decision for the defamation. And the jury found that Carroll had proved by clear and convincing evidence that specifically Trump's October 2022 Truth Social post statement was false, and that Trump knew or recklessly disregarded its falsity, and that Trump clearly made that statement, or those statements, with malice. E. Jean is the winner. E. Jean won her case. She won with flying colors. And next up was the damages to be awarded. And so the damages were as follows. I almost never hear someone correctly identify the damages. The basic understanding of the damages, just to make it simple, is that she was awarded $2 million for the sexual assault and she was awarded $3 million for the defamation. Okay, but the defamation was, to be more detailed, fell into a few different categories. So I'm just going to go over those. So it was $2 million in compensatory, I can't say that word, compensatory damages for the sexual assault claim. $1 million in that same kind of damages, I'm not saying it again, for the defamation, pain, suffering, reputational harm beyond the repair program. And then there was $1.7 million specifically for the reputation repair program, and then another $280,000 in punitive damages for the defamation. And that was specifically for Trump's malicious, willful disregard of Carroll's rights. That was specifically for Trump continuing to defame Carroll after he had been warned, after he's already being sued for this, and continuing to do it over and over, even throughout his deposition, throughout the trial itself, after the trial started, going on Truth Social and doing it anyway. So all of that came to a total of $5 million. What a glorious day that this whole thing is finally over. Trump's been brought to justice. Carroll won, and that's the end, right? I mean, we never have to talk about this again. Justice has been served, and let's all go on with our lives, and great. Right? If only. But no. Hi, have you ever met Donald J. Trump?
Hello, friend.
Donnie John? He's a real character, you know? He cannot lose. He literally cannot accept defeat. He will not accept defeat. And even when he is defeated, he will never admit defeat. So this was not over, unfortunately. He was never going to let this be over until, over his dead body, I guess. I don't know where it would end, because he still hasn't agreed that he lost the 2020 election. So, I don't think he'll ever admit that he lost this trial or these trials. So obviously, what would you do if you were in the mind of Donald Trump upon losing this case? Obviously, you would go into a town hall with CNN and you would defame Carroll some more. Obviously. I mean, hello, that's what you would do. And that's what he did. It's just wild. I just can't. So the very evening that the verdict was announced, he was in a town hall meeting event where he was again defaming Carroll. So Donald Trump, actually, the time that the town hall was taking place and was televised, the trial was still ongoing. The verdict was given that day, but he made these statements anyway, and he reiterated that he never met her, fully proven by way of photo. So that is an outright lie, and he knows it's a lie at this point, very clearly knows it's a lie at this point. It was even discussed with him in his deposition that that's not true, to say that he never met her, because he knows he met her. So he said it again. He again claimed that her accusations were false and politically motivated, even though he admitted in his deposition tapes that he had no knowledge of her political alignment, no knowledge of anything about her within the political scope, and that he had done no research on her, and neither had his team. He also called her claims made up, said she was a crazy person, this is a hoax, all that stuff, again, before his verdict was even finished. And the thing is, he never stopped doing it. He continued after that night too. He never stopped. And then, of course, the next thing that Donald Trump did was his team appealed the verdict. Obviously, we saw that coming, right? So the verdict was read on May 9th, and Trump appealed the verdict by May 11th. And the appeal was cited with the argument that evidence was improperly admitted. So it was on the basis that it should not have been allowed for the Access Hollywood tapes and for the two witnesses about prior bad acts, which were Jessica Leeds and Natasha Stoynoff's testimony. While that was still up in the air, in June of 2023, Trump's team also then requested a reduced award for the damages. So they requested for it to be reduced to under $1 million, or for there just to be a whole new trial held. And in their reasoning for this, they mischaracterized the jury's non-R-word finding was supporting Trump's claim that the assault had never even happened. That's not what it supported at all, because they clearly found him liable for sexual assault. So that was quickly denied. But he's not done yet. He has so many tricks up his sleeve, and he will dispense them on anyone he needs to that at any time tries to hold him accountable, go against him, speak out against his lies, prove him wrong, show that he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing, go against his agendas that are horrible, hurt other people, anything like that. He's going to pull out all the tricks and stops to get his way. So on June 27th, 2023, Trump countersues Carroll. He files a counterclaim alleging that Carroll actually defamed him when she told CNN.
Yes, he did R-word me.
In a response to a question about the jury not finding him liable for specifically R-word under that legal definition. So it was explained that yes, he did, which even Judge Kaplan very fully detailed in his post-trial notes and official documents, stating that it was still an R-word by every definition known to the public and the accepted definition. But he still tried it. And then the deal just keeps getting sweeter, because July 11th, 2023, the Biden DOJ drops its position. So after nearly 3 years, over 2 different administrations and DOJs, the Justice Department finally just formally drops its argument that Trump was acting within the scope of the presidential office when he made the claims for the defamation case number 1, which is still in limbo, remember. It's still in limbo, being decided whether or not they can claim his presidential Westfall Act immunity, whatever, and the DOJ could step in for him, okay? So the Biden DOJ on July 11th formally stated that they are dropping their position, that they are not going to uphold the Westfall Act. So with that, Carroll Trial 1 could finally move forward, the original case. So here we go again.